Hey, Luke, I'm excited to have you on. Those that don't know Luke, we met recently and he's going to share a bit about who he is, but we had a conversation, I'm not sure, a few months back,
hmm
and I've been working on getting you on the show and really hit it off. Very similar interests, very similar passion, yet different. But we both have a heart for men, for fathers. And Luke is doing some amazing, incredible work and has been actually for quite some time working with men, fathers, sons, has some incredible things he's doing, and I really was excited to have him on. So I'm glad we're finally here to actually sit down. But before we jump into the topic, how you doing?
I'm excellent. I'm so happy to be here. Love the show. Love what you're up to. And yeah, we are on this kind of similar mission of supporting men and fathers to be, better versions of themselves. So anytime I can have a conversation about that, I'm excited.
Yeah, and I am too. I mean, that's what gets me very excited to have conversations. Is the exact thing is helping, and having a roadmap, having dialogues, conversations, as well as very practical things that we do,
hmm
moving from the conversations to actually doing something and creating something to help men and fathers. And I love it. I love doing this. So, and I know you do as well. Can you tell us just a bit about who Luke is? Kind of let the audience know who's
Absolutely.
Luke.
Yeah. So I'm a coach. I coach men and I coach leaders.
Hmm.
And then I also lead rites of passage work. So I'm a guide supporting boys through rites of passage programs, honoring the passage from childhood into adolescence.
That that's so rad, and that's actually our conversation today is the rites of passage, and I love that you work with men and fathers as a coach, and a bit about your background, like how long you been doing this, just so we know and have a sense of Luke's experience.
I've been leading retreats for over 20 years. So I started in my early 20s. I started retreats for young adults
Mm,
around their sense of purpose and passion and connecting them with mentors and elders and started coaching out of that. So I've been at this for several decades now. I took
yeah,
a few detours in the middle and, got trained as a social worker and a few other things, but I've been doing this work for quite a bit now.
a long time, and you've any number of how many men you've worked with, like ballpark?
Oh goodness, it's got to be in the thousands at this point. I
Yeah,
that's a great question. When you've been doing it for over 20 years, it's
yeah,
several hundred over a year, and it adds up. So it's been a while.
yeah. So let's just jump in, man. Let's just jump
Yeah.
into this topic of, and this is for really anyone listening right now to this, whether you're a father, a guy, a mother, no matter who you are, because my audience is definitely split, and as far as listenership, and I think this topic, when we were having this conversation, it really resonated with me personally, but also thinking about this, this call that we all look for, and it rites of passage also ties in purpose, meaning, who we are, identity, and our connection to something larger than just our who we are individually, but to elders, mentors, all these things, and then just kind of deeper vision. And no matter where you are right now, I think there's something from this that will speak to you. You don't have to be necessarily a guy or a son to get something out of this. I think really, I think I would say that we all probably need some level of rites of passage, no matter
hmm
who we are. That there's something, I think, mystical, spiritual, connecting, healthy, holistic when we begin to examine our life through this lens of this. How do we progress through this life, and what is our purpose and intention? Who is guiding us through it? And I know that a lot of people I've worked with tend to not have someone guiding them on a rite of passage. That they're
hmm
longing for someone to be there for them and guide them, and they're kind of, there's no one here, so I got to figure it out. So I'm excited to have this conversation. So what is, can you just jump in? So rites of passage, you've been doing this work again for about 2 decades.
hmm
So what is kind of your methodology now as you begin to work with specifically men and fathers on helping their kids through this process?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. Like this, there's something about a rite of passage that is usually relevant to any human, and I would even
Mhm.
say like it's kind of baked into our DNA. We
Mm.
have this very, very deep need to have a sense of belonging and a sense of community. We are highly social creatures, right? It wasn't so long ago if we were somehow lost from the tribe or kicked out of the tribe that may mean death, right? So it's like
Mm.
hardwired into our behavior, into our nervous system, this feeling of belonging. And so, a rite of passage is the honoring in a community of belonging from one way of being into a new way of being. So it's baked into our DNA, this need for belonging, right? And for, throughout human history, there's been an opportunity for humans to mark one way of being into a new way of being, or one stage of life into a new stage of life that is kind of shared in the tribe, in the village, in the community, right? These experiences. And we can think about a few very obvious ones, right? Like birth is a rite of
Mm,
passage. It's a
mm,
passage from one way into a new way, being born, and the community kind of rallies around and celebrates new life. Death is another very obvious one, right? Community comes together and there's grief rituals and life honoring rituals, right? This is a rite of passage. And then there's a myriad other stages of passage throughout one's life. And as a culture, these are the ones that have been a bit lost, right?
mm,
And a particular dearth of like these honorings around the passage from childhood into adulthood. And this is, and I think we see evidence of this in the culture when we don't have uh, mentorship and eldership and ritual and ceremony honor one way of being and into a new way. We start to look for it because we are such highly social creatures. We will do just about anything for that sense of belonging that rite of passage or ceremony can provide us. So my point of view is we have a culture that is largely run by what we might say uninitiated men who have
mm,
not been initiated into their adulthood.
mm,
And there is essentially a feeling of being a boy. There's a
mm,
on the inside experience, in the heart, in the emotional experience, is one of not having much direction or clarity or mentorship about how to deal with emotions and what it means to be a man of honor and integrity and to live for something greater than your selfish desires, right?
mm,
And so we have a culture that is largely run by uninitiated men, and we can look around and see what that looks like. And there's some pretty maladaptive and kind of painful and
mm,
dangerous ways, the forms that can take. So that's kind of the larger context around this, right? And then we can talk a little bit about my methodology, which is essentially taking some boys and their dads and bringing them out into the wilderness for a
yeah,
weekend
yeah.
and helping honor that passage.
And can you speak a bit more before we go there? Because I definitely want to get to that of what your methodology is and kind of your vision, and not only your vision, but what you've been implementing and enacting with these relationships. Can you speak a bit more some of the, the dangers or issues you tend to see with some of those guys that come in with the uninitiated men kind of running things and kind of, yeah, again, some maladaptive behaviors or things that we're noticing with these guys, and maybe some of the men you worked with when they first came to you before they've done this, and then maybe speaking to, once we do that, maybe talking to some of the positive differences you saw in these guys that maybe then were initiated and had some roadmap for them.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Our culture, I think, squeezes men into a box, right? There's a box around what is acceptable around
Mm,
our own relationship to our emotions and our feelings as men. It squeezes us into a box around how we provide and squeezes us into a box around what the definition of success is. And that box is
mm,
fairly narrow. It's pretty much in the financial realm. It squeezes us into a box around what you might just call like ego identity, like a sense of where I derive my self-worth. And for the culture, like my opinion is the culture generally would have us kind of just grind it out at all costs,
mm,
all costs to ourselves, to our families, to the culture. And so there's to the planet, you might even say, right? Like
mm,
there's a um the idea of success is like win at all costs, right?
mm,
And with not a lot of sensitivity to the impact. And underneath that all is like a need to fit in, right? So we can see the the lack of initiation shows up, especially in young men. We can see some pretty obvious places, right? Like initiation into, I don't know, fraternities, for example. Not necessarily the healthiest place for men at times, right?
yeah,
But it's a deep sense of belonging. Or
right.
it could be initiation into gangs, right? It could be
Mm,
initiation into crime and initiation into greed, initiation
mm,
into taking advantage of women to meet
mm,
some sort of core need around belonging and feeling okay with oneself, to
mm,
kind of override the shame that can be given to us. So these are some of the forms that it can take. Usually it's like an uninitiated man often looks like somebody who is not very connected to their emotions, feels a bit dead inside, does
mm,
not have a great sense of meaning or purpose in their lives because it's all based in financial outcomes, and usually is not particularly connected to anything greater than himself, right? There's
mm,
there's like a listlessness around things like wonderment,
Yeah.
awe,
Mm.
connection to nature, connection to beauty. So that's kind of what it can look like without proper guidance from mentors and elders that are helping us know the ways of what it means to be in a place of healthy masculinity, right?
Yeah. And how does it tend to manifest when they're in that place with their relationship with their spouses or their children? How do you tend to see, or what have you tended to see, or some themes you've noticed over 20 years of doing this?
Takes many different forms, but there's an emotional avoidance, an inability to be with difficult emotions, whether it's mine or someone else's,
Mm.
right? So we don't know what to do with difficult emotions, so we become very dysregulated and then kind of check out, right? That shows up in relationship. There's a way to just like follow the next comfortable thing and not do the hard thing. So maybe a series of shallow relationships. Yeah, I mean, it can take a myriad forms, right? Like,
Yeah.
so there's a way in which being initiated into something, into like a deeper way of being, requires a level of being with one's own discomfort and doing hard things, right?
Mm.
And that has all sorts of applications. We do this, like, you think about the ancient times, the like those that live closer to the earth, when they would initiate the boys into manhood, they would do things like, and actually some places in the world still do this, like go out and kill a lion,
Mm. Yeah.
and when you come back, you're then a man.
Yeah.
And the men of the village will help you learn how to do that and what it takes to go kill a lion, or
Mm.
tie yourself to the Sundance pole, and dance it out for, your time, or do a
Hmm.
vision quest, or these things about like doing something really, really difficult
Yeah.
that requires us to dig deeper than we thought we could.
Mm.
And so that's part of it, is that willingness to do very difficult things.
Yeah. And with that, what do you see in our culture nowadays with people willing to do difficult things? What are some things you're noticing now in our 2023?
It's this glorious time where we are actually redefining what it means to be a man. It wasn't so long ago, that a man that was emotional, it was a sign of weakness. And I think we really current state 2023, we are rewriting that story. And this whole idea of like, there's power in my own emotional awareness. I actually
Mm.
have more personal power and can actually get more things done in the world, have greater influence on those around me, by being able to first identify what's happening in my heart and
Mm.
in my body, and then being able to articulate that and speak to that. There's all sorts of
Mm.
information, right? Like, I coach a lot of CEOs of companies around their own leadership, and there's a lot of evidence that shows emotional intelligence is actually more important than other forms of intelligence when leading a large human system like a company, right?
Yeah.
Because your ability to track what's happening, there's all sorts of information about
Mm.
what's happening in the company that's based in my emotions. Not to mention, if I can read it in other people and I
Mm.
know what's happening for them, I can then influence them in a more deeply way, and essentially just, get things done, right? It's just a more effective way. So there's actually power in emotional intelligence, and I think we're redefining that. We're waking up to that culturally right now.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely see that for sure. We are in the midst of rewriting, and there's still a lot of stigma around that, I think. But you're right. You're seeing, 40 years ago, whatever, it wasn't that way. Still very much stigmatized, and now still there. And there's still not I think a week that goes by that I wouldn't have a guy coming in my office that would say, you know, share some of the classic stigmas
Hmm.
of being weak and vulnerable and not burdening people, but it's still coming in. So there's this, I think, a deep longing for men to be seen and known. But I think there's still some barriers, and at the same time we are seeing it being rewritten. We are seeing it, more of it. We're seeing it kind of translate into different arenas, business, not only mental health, but we're seeing it kind of spread, so to speak, in a healthier way. That you're right. I've read quite a few books on EQ, emotional intelligence, and saying, yeah, they're arguing this is probably more important than IQ, if not as valuable, if not more, depending on, because you can have all the IQ in the world, but if you can't read or help people, then what good are you? And these are business books that I've read, and so you're right. There is something to say that they're noticing this, and yet here we are. We're still helping, and we're being guides. And as you're working with men now, what are some what are some of the things working with men and fathers now with this rites of passage, when you hear their stories, and this is generalizing, when you hear their stories, especially as they're coming to see you initially and saying, "Hey, help me with this thing of rites of passage and with my son and connection," and when you hear their stories, do they tend to come from like a lineage or a storyline of having their fathers kind of teaching them this? You're shaking your
It's
head.
very rare. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very rare. And actually, I'll share a little bit of my personal journey. I
Sure.
am actually my father did invite me into this. So when I
Mm.
was 22 years old, he invited me to a men's retreat. I was kind of I grew up an actor, and
Okay.
it was like my everything. I was just like on stage. I was modeling. I was doing, and it was really like my whole universe. And then when I got
Mm.
to be about like 17, 18, 19, it just that was no longer the thing to do. It kind of
Mhm.
faded, and there was a period of several years where I was very kind of lost and
Mm.
rudderless and just a general like stuck in the mud malaise, not like kind of listless, not a lot of life force moving through me. And my
Mm.
father said, "Hey, why don't you come check out this men's weekend with me? I've done this experience. I think you might like it." And let me tell you, being surrounded by 80 dudes who were just like on fire, like looked me in the eye, and I knew like they weren't gonna put up with my BS, but they also like were gonna hold me to, a fierce level of self-examination, really
Mm.
looking at my own shortcomings and shadows and my own pain and my own sorrow, but also would do it in this very kind of compassionate way. It really, really changed my life. And there was
Mm.
actually a moment in this particular men's retreat where we were all kind of outside standing around a fire. There was like
Hmm.
80 dudes around a fire. And an elder called me up to the front and said, basically, like, you're no longer a boy, you're now a man. And presented me with a little bit of a token of that. And everybody cheered. And it was like I was 22 years old. And that moment like profoundly changed my life because it
Mm.
really did feel like I came a boy and I left a man. Like I knew what type of man I wanted to be now, which was like these guys that were, fierce. They were like strong, but they were also doing work about how the pains of the past impacted them. They all had these like mission statements about, what type of world they wanted to create that was like greater than just a selfish purpose. It was about something back to the community. And, there was like this transpersonal quality to it where all these dudes they knew what they were doing with their lives and they were on fire. And I spent a better part of a decade just like following them around, spending a lot of time with them.
Yeah.
And so for me that actually seeded all of this, was to
Mm.
have that experience at 22 and have it be so profound. And so as I work with boys and men now, most men don't have that experience that I had. And I really recognize that there's a way that we can still get it and still
Mhm.
give it, but they're often coming looking for a deeper connection with their boy, right? Like
Mm.
there's a thing about, I work specifically in the ages 10 to 14, right? These are not boys that are becoming men. These are children that are becoming teenagers, right? And it's a slightly different rite of passage than the initiation into manhood. This is an initiation into beginning to have a sense of belonging. So this is where like sports teams become really important, or a band, or the theater, or some sense of belonging and some sense of getting really good at something, a sense
Mm.
of mastery. And it's also when the body is changing
Hmm.
radically,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Just puberty happening
Yeah.
and all the hormones and the beginnings of, attraction, the sexual kind of experience coming on board. And in that, often there's like a disconnection that happens. I know I experienced it with my own son, that like my baby's no longer my baby. I'm not exactly sure how to relate to him. And so often they're looking for some way to kind of reach their boy, and also wanting to make sure that there's a foundation of connection when things start to really get more challenging through the teenage years. So that's really, the work that I'm doing is helping establish the bond between the father and the son, and doing some training and some education around what it means to be a man, and emotional awareness, and
Mm.
changing bodies, and connection to nature, and a lot of play and adventure.
Yeah. And when you think about that too, where you're teaching these guys, like what you mentioned it before, like I came out a man. arrived a boy, left a man, or helping these dads reach their sons and connecting to them and defining what it means to be a man. When you think about that from your work, from your personal journey, as well as work with the men and people you work with now, like how do you help them identify that? Is it, because we did talk about earlier the man box, right? It can be very rigid in
Mhm.
our culture. And so, with the work that you're doing, right, we're expanding that, but how do you define that? How do you help men identify what it means to be a quote unquote man? What does that look
Mm.
like?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a few. I've just oriented it around a few principles and left it fairly flexible for men to try on what that means for them.
Mm,
So, some of the principles are a man's strength is both in his body and his feelings, right? And so we frame emotions through the lens of strength and courage. We also do, I teach a lot around warriorship, right? This idea of like, what does it mean to be a warrior? Like, so one of the principles is a warrior has one eye out and one eye in. So
mm,
one eye out in the world, navigating the world, and does that with a lot of presence, and one eye in, examining my own heart and my own emotions, right?
mm,
So that's a principle: one eye out, one eye in. Strength is, we can have physical strength and emotional strength. That's a principle. We have another principle, which is men clean up after themselves and sometimes other people. And so the principle there is just, we obviously clean the space. We'd spend a lot of time in my programs outside in nature. So we have it's basically a trash altar. Every time you go on a hike, you bring back a piece of trash and we make something beautiful out of it, cleaning up after others. But there's
yeah.
also this thing about, we clean up after ourselves. Like, it's okay to apologize. There's power in apology. There's
Mm,
power in amends. Sometimes we clean up after the harm of other men,
mm,
right? So in our relationships, often people, our lovers, our partners may come to us with a broken heart of
mm,
past harms, and that we're really a stand for helping them heal that, right? So there's an idea about, we tidy up the harms that we've caused, the clutter that we've left, and that of others. So that's a principle. So yeah, those are a few. I mean, there's more, but that's we kind of orient around, what does it mean to be a man? He's emotionally intelligent. He honors boundaries in himself and others. He's courageous, and then this idea of connected to something greater than himself. And
yeah.
this is where, nature just becomes its own character. And when we spend time outside, enough time outside, we learn so much about wonderment and awe and terror and beauty just by being outside in the elements.
And when men are doing this too, do you notice any? Is there one or few of these even tenets or principles you teach that do you get any initial resistance? And if you do, which ones you tend to get initial resistance with, or are they kind of open? They're kind of
Not
ready
so
for it.
much. Yeah,
They're
I
kind of
think
ready.
I think the people that come to this, the men that come to this, are looking answers to kind of
Okay,
orient their
sure.
lives around, and so,
Yeah.
it's less about like, we don't do this in like a dogmatic way. It's more just like, this is an opportunity about, you know being a stand for something. I think there's so much vagueness around what it means to be a man. The
Hmm.
conversation around gender alone is just very much in flux right now in our culture. And so to be a stand for men and masculinity being a force, a generative force in the world, and
Mm.
what are the principles that would allow masculinity to not only be a necessary ingredient for the future of our planet and our community,
Yeah.
but being a healing agent for all the
Mm.
harms of the past.
Mm.
That's really what I want to be a stand for as a man myself.
Yeah.
And I think, most men, when given the opportunity, would say, yeah, that's the type of man I want to be. I want to be a man of integrity and accountability, connected to my feelings, but also have massive impact on the people around me, and in a positive way. I want to be an excellent father who's very present to
Mm.
my children, both present with time and space, but also present with my love and affection. I haven't found any men that have been resistant to that yet.
That's good. No, that's good. Well, I guess it makes sense, right? If they're on your program, they're in a place of readiness. They've maybe been wrestling for a while, and they're like, "Oh, I need to do something." So they're yeah, you're right. They're open. And I love that you said this generative. You use the word generative and healing and restorative and for the harm caused, and even maybe not by me, but like maybe
Mhm.
previous men, different generations. And there's a term that's been around for a while. It's nothing new, but the term toxic masculinity. So when you hear that term, what comes to your mind when you hear that term as a guy, or what's your initial reaction even to that phrase?
Yeah. Yeah, it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
It's complicated. I mean, again, it's like I have this deep commitment to rewrite what it means to be a man. And
Mm,
that's where I go with it is like, okay, I totally understand that, most of the serious problems that we're facing, have been based in an unconscious, self-centered version of masculinity. And that's where the toxicity comes from, right? But men are not toxic.
mm,
There's a shame even, I think, that I've had to work through and many men have had to work through around just being a man. And I can honestly say, like, I don't have that at this point in my life. I
mm,
truly believe that it's possible to be a man of power and purpose, open-hearted and clear, and be in your full force of masculinity, and that is actually what the world needs right now. That
mm,
is what the world needs, is men out there strong and clear and leading their communities and cleaning up the garbage of the past. So for me, when I hear it, I'm sympathetic. I don't really, I don't take it personally, but I've had to do a lot of work about, my own shame and where I've caused harm in my, and still to this day, cause harm in my own unconscious, my
yeah.
own pain and my own self-centeredness. Like, right, we all have this,
Mm,
and it requires a deep, courageous examination. But at the end of the day, I don't buy the story that masculinity itself is toxic.
yeah.
I would think of this more as like wounded masculinity.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely agree with that as well. It's just a term that is out there, and even more so with social media. And I have also sympathy and understanding, but I think masculine itself is not toxic and at all. Right? It could be unhealthy, it could be immature, unbalanced, things like that. But what you're positing and what you're doing, the work you're doing, is really, if anything, would come right up against that. That it's a healing model of masculinity, right? That it's like, well, how do we help these men? And how do we be generative and restorative, and not only our community but the world? Like, that's what you're doing, and with your work is teaching these guys, with picking up your trash, right? It's like not only your trash, but figure literally and figuratively, and like you're teaching the one eye in, one eye out. It's like, okay, what to do that self-examination, which I think a lot of guys at first don't have that capacity. It's more outward, right?
Mhm.
It's the defensiveness. How do I survive that lone wolf? But the work, the warrior mindset that you're teaching is like, how do I examine? And self-examination, it does, I think, takes a lot of courage and bravery. It's not weak, right? I'm sure, as I know, when I did it, when I was doing it through my initial healing process, it's very humbling to look inward and to examine, unintentional harm I've caused to myself and those around me just based on my behavior, and having to like take responsibility for that. That's very humbling for sure.
Yeah, truly. And usually when we look at our own areas that we've caused harm, we start to then unravel the origin of where
Right.
that, comes from in us, which inevitably it was given to us, our own places we were hurt and
Mm,
we weren't given what we needed and we were somehow put in a box or shamed, right? Like
right.
there's this deep, pervasive wound that happens in all humans, but the form it takes in many men is, leaves us feeling isolated and alone, and
Yeah.
then seeking out belonging and seeking out, assuaging that, soothing the part of us that just, frankly, at the core of it, it's like a self-loathing and shame that most humans have some version of it that needs tending to, that needs healing. So that's part of it, right? Like there's the reconciliation with those that we've harmed. And my own journey around this, when my marriage ended, I so I was married for 8 years, and then my marriage ended, and I did a little dating, and then I just realized, like, this isn't going to work for me. I need to, like, stop, pause.
Mm,
And I did this thing I worked with a coach, and he took me through what he called a feminine cleanse and
mm,
reconciliation, where I did no dating at all
mm,
for 6 months, and no even flirting, no nothing. It was like I just put a veil over me when I would go in public and just would be friendly and kind, but not hooking anyone
mm,
in. And in that process, I got to see my own kind of funky patterns around how I was filling a hole in myself by
mm,
relating to other people. And
mm,
then I went back and any past partner, any woman, in this case for me, any woman that I'd ever been with that I caused harm, I went back and actually reached out to them and reconciled how I'd harmed them and apologized and asked for nothing from them, even if I felt harmed by them. That was not part of this process. It was
Yeah.
purely to apologize and make right, and then honor them for all the gifts that they gave me. And
Mm.
let me tell you, this 6 months, my goodness, did it
Hmm.
change me as a man, like really,
Wow.
truly changed me in a deep, deep way about, just how I love people in my life and the weight and the pain of all the shame that I've been carrying around women that I had hurt in the past out of my own unconsciousness. So there is a way that we can kind of like tidy this all up and clean it up and
Mm.
free our own heart. And some of those conversations I had were just some of the most beautiful conversations I've had in my life,
Mm.
of honoring and owning my part and kind of just ending that cycle, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, no, that's powerful, and you've done the work, so you know what it is to because of your own personal experience of going through that. Would very humbling, I would assume too. Of like,
oh
wow,
yeah.
I mean, that's I would say that does take a lot of again bravery, determination, courage to do that kind of work, to go in and say, and to do it humbly, not expecting anything in return, but to actually genuinely do this.
Mm-hmm.
As I think a big sign of actual emotional maturity of being able to and healthy conversation rather than kind of there's no manipulation in that. It's like, no, I'm actually doing this. I'm not expecting anything, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and open to whatever, with that from your work, I could see why then, how, from your personal story of navigating this and your own kind of healing and your vision too, to help bring healthy, positive masculinities and having the rite of passage and how needed it is for the next generation to be connected because like you said, I think the ones that are connected, ones that they reach to things because we all long for connection. We're wired for
Mm-hmm.
relationships, right? So if we don't have anyone giving us something that's positive and restorative, we will find it, like you said, gangs or drugs or you know or our a lot of men work and money and finances, like this is just who I am and that's my rite of passage. But my next paycheck, my next
Mm-hmm.
like the house is my rite of passage, or my next car, or my next sale, which those things aren't necessarily bad or wrong or evil. But if you tie yourself in it, that's when it leads to emptiness because it's never going to fully satisfy. But the work you're doing now and have been with these guys is that deeper connection. Like you said, you were in a, well, environment with 80 guys looking at you that were fierce, but all had a clear vision that
Mm-hmm.
they had maybe some had physical strength, where some maybe had big muscles, maybe some didn't, but it wasn't about that's a type of strength. But the other strength you saw was emotional strength, maybe mental strength, spiritual strength, other things that were they were showing you that strength comes in many forms. It isn't just this one rigid view of I have to have the big six pack and muscles to be strong and conquest and beat people down, but no, here's the other types of strengths we have. We have vision, we have a mission statement, we have an idea, a clear vision of who we're supposed to be and who we're trying to be within our community. And then it's always about something else outside of self. You said
Mm-hmm.
that too. It's always about something external beyond my own individual personhood, but about the community, about relationships. And then you saw that enacted and then you were drawn to that. You said, I hung out with them for 10 years and
Mm-hmm.
kept doing it because there's something powerful that what I didn't have or maybe was missing in my previous life or when I was younger. There's something mesmerizing and enticing and pulling me in to this way of living. And then you have been. And now doing it with these other men that you've been working with for 20 years. Can you speak a bit about your process as well as what are some of the positives or pros you've now seen in these guys' lives and sons' lives change of doing this process? Like what have you maybe some reports you've gotten back from guys
Yeah.
doing this kind of,
Yeah.
weekend?
Yeah, yeah. So I run a program called the Father Son Connection Experience. That this is, that a lot of this is based in, right? So one of my favorite reports is I actually just got it a few weeks ago. So one of the mothers, I was talking to one of the moms after, he came back and I was like, hey, how's he doing? And she said, well, he says now he's a young warrior and he thinks that he deserves some more independence and should be able to make some more decisions about how he's spending his time. So, I love it, right? It's not exactly what we were intending, but there's something about that I really love because
Yeah.
it's the initiation, the rite of
Mm,
passage is into oneself, right? So he is feeling more centered in himself, more
mm,
confident, more capable of being independent, that's very much what this stage is about, is exercising and experimenting with independence and good judgment and belonging, right? So he's saying, look, mom, back off a little bit. I'm a young warrior, give me a shot at, making some of these calls myself. And, I just love that. There's like an
Mm,
energy behind that
yeah.
is really what we want to cultivate
Mm,
in these young men, is a sense of like confidence in themselves, clear-headedness. I've also heard quite a bit. So we do a whole thing on the last morning around changing bodies and puberty and sex. And we have a certified sex educator come in and spend,
mm,
a couple of hours with the boys and their dads.
mm,
And the way we do it is we do like a blind Q&A where anybody can ask a question anonymously on a card.
mm,
Everybody actually asks a question, and then we get through as many questions as we can, right? And so they get a chance to really understand a bit more about sex. We do some work around spatial boundaries. So we do an
mm,
exercise where it's you line up across from your dad, and then you call your dad closer with a
mm,
hand gesture, closer.
mm,
And then you pause your dad with a hand gesture. So kind of like a stop sign. And then you move your dad back. And then your dad does the same for you. And you're in control spatially about how close or how far away you want your dad to
mm,
be. And then you also get the experience of someone holding a boundary with you spatially.
mm.
And this is a way that we see is a good way to teach consent, right? Like,
Yeah.
what's it like to have someone say stop, and how does that
Mm,
feel in my body
mm,
when someone tells me to stop or move away, or someone tells me to come closer? And so
mm.
we're teaching these boys essentially, like, the nervous system regulation. It's an embodied practice of nervous
Yeah.
system regulation around consent. So combining these two elements, right, of like sex ed and kind of embodied consent, what we hear from the dads is like one of the number one things that they'll come back to us with is like, thank you so much. It
Mm,
gave us a runway to talk about sex and changing bodies in a way that I didn't have before. I just didn't even know
mm.
how to bring it up.
Yeah.
And it's not that we're doing a heavy dose of sex ed. It's actually very light. Turn them on. We literally spend like an hour and a half in this sex ed session, and then we send them off for like an hour and a half hike with their dads right
Mm,
away, right?
mm,
They go from that to being alone in the woods with their dad.
mm.
And that's the intention, right? Is like, let just open the conversation in a
Yeah.
way that's like sex positive, neutral, not
Yeah.
a lot of
Shame or anything.
shame or
Yeah.
garbage,
Yeah.
and then let them go talk to their dads. And
Mm.
so that's a piece that we get a lot of feedback around, is like, thank you for for giving me the runway to
Yeah.
have the talk,
Yeah.
which I didn't know how to do. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a common theme. A lot of men don't know how to have the talk at all. And in fact, I did another podcast with a guest on, which is for girl dads, talking to their daughters about
mm,
sex. And same
mm,
thing is, how do we do that? Like, because especially for a lot of these guys, well, no one really talked to me about it outside of, don't do it. Essentially, I'm very paraphrasing what they said, but just don't do it unless you're married or, it's things like that, basic stuff. And it's like, well, how do we talk to our daughters, especially
mhm,
if I'm uncomfortable, how can I? So having a roadmap to do that is so key, because
mhm.
guess what? They're all asking the question anyway, whether we
Oh,
want
for
them to or
sure.
not,
Yeah.
whether your daughter or son. And having a runway, I mean, that's key. I think now I
Yeah.
know I can come back to that, and we have a place where it's even footing, and we can have this conversation where it's not shaming but inviting, because that's really what kids are needing. That's the mentorship piece, right? Is having a
Yeah.
mentor and their dad being a mentor, being able to
That's
be
right.
someone their dads can approach. Because a lot of themes I heard too of guys in my office, and you could probably relate. Not always, but a lot of them is either there's no way I would ever talk to my dad about anything like that. Like, he was
Mhm.
unapproachable. We could not do anything like that, but they wanted to. There's always this long, I want to talk to my dad, but I know I couldn't.
Yeah.
And when I do like the miracle question, what could you change with your relationship with your dad? It's often that we could just have a conversation and be heard versus just spoken at or lectured at, or, you know, or just being even present, and how powerful that relationship can be.
Yeah, and, I'm under no illusions to think like I'm going to be the guy that my son turns to for
Totally.
every question, right? Like, that's just impossible. There's an individuation process that is
Right.
necessary in human development. We have to push off against our parents.
Mm,
But if we can lay the ground of health in a way where the relationship is tended to, and we've invested some experiences together where we've,
mm,
gone through cool stuff together, we've had some deeper conversations. My hope is that these fathers are one of the people
right.
that their children will turn to at times when something big comes up.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the best we can hope for. I think it's really actually important. This is one of the other things we teach, is that the the boys in this case, or the children, have like a trusted adult in their life that they can turn to
Mm,
that is not their parents,
mm,
that they can, if they, if they have questions about whatever it is, sex or whatever,
yeah.
that there's somebody they know they can, that that is a solid human that will
Mm,
help them, that's outside of the parents. And I think that's important as well. And I've really tried to encourage that in my
yeah.
children, and will continue to do so. One other thing on the, because I'm a girl dad as well,
Yeah.
my hack, if you will, for this
Yeah.
has been buying age appropriate sex ed books, which I've
Mm,
done since they were like 3 or 4 years old, and reading those, interspersing those in bedtime stories. Right.
yeah. Yeah.
So I still read to my children every night. They're 12 and 10, almost 10. And the rhythm is, you pick a book, I pick a book, you pick a book, I pick a book.
Mm,
So, we finish up her book, and
yeah.
then it's my book. And sometimes it'll be like an age appropriate sex ed book. And she may be like,
Nice.
oh, I don't know, but then she always like, she's always very into it. And then
Yeah.
again, it gives an opportunity to then say,
Yeah.
like, do you have questions? Or this is, I may say, like, this is how I think about this particular topic related to sex. So it's a little easier when they're younger like that, right? She's 9,
Yeah.
becoming 10, but that has definitely worked for just keeping the conversation alive
Yeah.
and not letting it get into the shadows, right?
Yeah. 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 I love that hack. And that comes with being intentional, right? It's like I'm intentionally
Mhm.
creating the space to have dialogues ongoing. And then there's no pressure. It's like, if you got questions, great. If here, if not, okay. But there's
Mhm.
still having the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that, the main topic of that book, she wrote a book called Talk with Her. Great book, by the way, for girl dads. And it's
Mhm.
essentially a big theme is you got to keep the communication open consistently. And because they're looking for that, and as they get into teens, there is a natural pushback. And
Mhm.
she talks about that too, but how neat it is for us to show up. And I'm wondering, as I look at the time,
Mhm.
this other idea that you sprinkled in there, implicitly, but really that's what your program's about and also what you experience, but the idea of mentorship and how important that is, like, in our life. So what would you say to, like, the importance of having a mentor in your life? Like, why should we do that? Why is that important? And then also maybe having a mentee below us. Like,
Mhm.
where's power in that, do you think?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a great question. Well, I mean, when we look at the classic models around initiation, like, it doesn't work well at all unless there's mentorship and eldership. Like, we can peers initiating peers. I think we can see how messed up that can be, right? There's an element around rites of passage where there has to be mentorship and eldership, because it's initiating into what? What are we
Mm,
moving from to? Like, there's
yeah.
one way of being into a new way of being. And the mentor's job, or the elder's job, is to articulate, educate, and hold the new way of being,
Mm,
so that, and teach it in a way that's easily understood and easily in the language of the person that's moving through the rite of passage, right? So, peers doing that to each other, it doesn't work. There's all sorts of harm that can be caused. So it's like core necessary ingredient to an intentional rite of passage, in my opinion.
mhm,
For me personally, it's been this remarkable tool that I've used over many years of finding someone in my life that that has something that can pull me into a new way of being, or a deeper level of myself, that can take me deeper than I can take myself.
mhm,
Right? There's a thing about just continuously, it's been a lifelong journey finding those people, those teachers, those coaches, those guides, those therapists, that I just know when I talk to them, like, they're going to take me deeper into myself, or they're going to teach me some new skill that I don't have.
mm,
And dedicating, just being a lifelong student, and just know that I even budget for it, right? Like, I just know I'm going to spend 5
yeah,
to 10%, usually around 7% of my revenue goes to me paying coaches, guides, mentors. Some of them are unpaid and, heart friends. Some of them are like experts, and I
yeah.
just pay them that. And it's just baked into my, the way I do life. And yeah, I think it's super important.
Yeah. One final question and we'll wrap up, and I guess we could go even farther, but if your vision of your view of, mentorship and rites of passage and creating like a healthier, masculinity in men, what would be your, like, mantra or phrase when it comes to that you would use to encourage men with that, when the rites of passage, becoming like healthier masculine men? What is your mantra? What's your saying? What's your go-to? Like, what would you currently right now in your phase of life doing this experience, like what is it that you kind of leave them with when you do their work?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I go back to this concept of bravery.
Hmm.
So bravery is not the absence of fear,
Hmm.
right? It's the feeling the fear and doing it anyway. And this is truly the warrior's path. The warrior will feel the fear of turning into his own heart and his own pain and his own sorrows of the past, his own shame. He will feel that fear of like, I don't know if I can do that, and he will do it anyway. He
Hmm.
will do it with a deep level of commitment, or moving through the world, doing something really scary, seeing something scary and tending to it anyway. This is
Hmm.
like the hero does this all the time, right? This is the
Yeah.
hero's journey of like seeing something that is happening, facing fear and doing it anyway. And
Hmm.
I think that's really at the core, that is healthy masculinity. There
Hmm.
is a deep bravery in that. And again, I think that's what the world is aching
Hmm.
for in men.
Yeah, I agree. We need more bravery. And something that, it continually stood out to me through this whole conversation is the like, and I think you even said it, if not implied it, is that this is not done alone. This is done in relationship. Like you said, you pay mentors, meaning you're not doing this alone. You're seeking out expertise and guidance. It's only through relationship that I think cultivates healthy, positive masculinity. It's not by ourselves, right? It's in people challenging us and
Hmm.
coming back to and learning and growing and teaching and that whole model. It's not in isolation, but always through community. And I think that I think a lot of men need that more so, that they're feeling very isolated, that I see, and need that connection. And when you get them in there, I think men rise to the occasion. I think when they're in
Hmm.
that space, they do, because they
Yeah.
see that there's other men doing the work, and there's something again enticing and inviting in, even if it's hard. They see other men taking the risk, and they're like, okay, I want that. And I think if we have more of what you're doing in our world, we'll see. We'll see the benefit of that. So with that said, since we're leading into it, hey, where can we find your work? Where can people get to you and see what Luke's up to?
Yeah, yeah. They can find me at lukeentrup.com. I've got a website there where I have some information about my coaching with men
Hmm.
and our father son program. And we have a specific website for that people want to go just check out the father son rites of passage program. It's fathersonconnection.com.
Hmm.
And I also have my own podcast, so you can hear me over at Crazy Wisdom, and that's in all the usual podcast channels.
And everyone listening, I'll be linked in the description, whether you're listening to this on audio or watching this video on YouTube. This will all be linked in the bottom. Direct links, click it to find really the good work that Luke is doing. And Luke and I were talking about this previously before we got on, is that, I think there's what we're seeing, and even the work we're doing, is that we're seeing a lot of men that were, I think, modeling relationship, bridge building, community by sharing each other's work and experiences that were, I'm not trying to one up Luke, and Luke's not trying to one up me, because that would be the kind of unhealthy side,
Hmm.
rigid view of what it means to be a man. But really seeing, I think, men do good work, relate to one another, grow, share each other's work. And so I love that I get to meet men like Luke and share what they're doing, because they get to reach people that I may not be able to reach in what I'm currently doing. And that's the beautiful thing, is that we need it. It takes a village, takes a community to do this work. So Luke, I thank you. I bless all the work you're doing, that you keep doing and have been doing. And I hope that you do it for the next 70 years, up until, you're way up there, and keep going. But thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Travis. Thanks for having me on.
See ya.